The email came in on a Tuesday, October 14th at 6:52 in the morning while I was sitting in my truck outside the unemployment office in Duluth with a thermos of bad coffee and about $400 left to my name. And subject line, seasonal property caretaker, immediate start, $6,200 a month. And I almost swiped it into the spam folder out of habit, the same way I deleted 40 other too good offers that year, except the sender's name stopped my thumb. And Voss Holdings LLC, and I'd seen that name on a for sale sign years back, nailed to a gate on a logging road outside Ellie, back when I still did seasonal trail maintenance for the Forest Service and had reason to drive those roads. And I opened it, and my name is Cole Elgren. I was 34 years old that October. And 11 months earlier, my wife Renee had taken our daughter Mabel and moved to her sister's place in Rochester. And I'd spent the better part of a year sinking, slow and then not slow at all, through a divorce, a repossessed Silverado, a torn rotator cuff from a warehouse job that ended the way most warehouse jobs end, for a 34-year-old body, and a mother in hospice care at St. Luke's, whose bills I was paying off $80 at a time out of unemployment checks that didn't stretch that far to begin with. And Renee didn't leave over any one thing. If I'm honest about it, she left over 18 months of me working doubles at a distribution center off Interstate 35, trying to outrun bills that kept multiplying anyway. Coming home too tired to be the kind of husband or father either of us had signed up for. And by the time my shoulder finally gave out on a pallet jack in September of the year before, tearing badly enough that surgery wasn't optional, there wasn't much marriage left to save even before the workers' comp fight started eating what savings we had. And Mabel was 5 when they moved, 6 by that October, and the 80-minute drive to Rochester on the weekends I could afford the gas for had become the closest thing I had to a schedule worth keeping. And my mother's decline had started around the same time, a diagnosis that turned into a series of worse diagnoses through that spring. And by October, she'd moved from her own apartment into hospice care permanently. And I was the only one of her 2 kids still living close enough in Minnesota to be there most days. My brother Ray having settled in Arizona a decade back and sending what money he could, but not much more than that. And I say all of this not to make excuses for what I did next, but because I think it matters, in a story like this one, that you understand exactly what kind of hole a person has to be standing in before an offer like Sandra Voss's ever looks like an answer, instead of a warning sign. And the email was short, and it said Voss Holdings owned a hunting and fishing property on the eastern edge of the Superior National Forest, roughly 11 miles up an unmaintained road off County Road 116, and that the property required a caretaker from November 1st through the first week of April, someone comfortable with isolation, capable of basic maintenance, and willing to live alone on-site for the duration, and room, board, propane, and satellite internet were included. And compensation was $6,200 a month, paid in 2 installments, half on the 15th and half on the 30th. Direct deposit, and there was a phone number and a name, a woman named Sandra Voss, and I called before I'd finished reading it twice. My old co-worker Denny Ruoff, who I called that same afternoon mostly to talk myself into it out loud, told me it sounded like a setup for either a scam or a murder, and laughed when he said it, and I laughed too, and neither of us really meant it as a joke by the end of the call. And Denny had worked the same warehouse floor as me for 6 years before it closed, and he knew the shape of my finances well enough to know I wasn't in a position to be picky. And he knew Renee well enough to know part of what was driving me wasn't just the money. And it was wanting to be able to tell my daughter, next time I saw her, that her father had done something instead of treading water in a 1-bedroom apartment on Piedmont Avenue. And Sandra Voss had the kind of voice that made you picture pearls and a cardigan over the phone, careful and clipped. And she answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting, and she told me the property was called Redfern, that it had been in her husband's family since the 1930s, when it operated as a logging camp, and that it had been a private hunting retreat since the 60s. And she said the caretaker's job was straightforward: keep the pipes from freezing in the 2 guest cabins and the main lodge, run the generator a few hours a day to keep the batteries charged, plow the access road after snow, and keep a log of any wildlife activity, especially anything unusual, and email it to her weekly. And she said the position had been vacant since late August. When I asked why, she paused just long enough for me to notice it, and said the last caretaker, and a man named Perry Dunlop, had decided the isolation wasn't for him and left early, and that before him, a young couple had lasted only 6 weeks, And I told her isolation didn't scare me, that I'd spent 4 seasons in a fire lookout outside Isabella and liked it fine, and she said that was good. That was exactly the kind of experience they wanted, and she emailed the contract that afternoon, and it ran to 11 pages, mostly boilerplate about liability and property damage. But 3 clauses stood out enough that I read them out loud to myself twice in my empty apartment. And the caretaker was required to remain on the property for the full term except for a single approved supply run per month, and to maintain a fire in the outdoor pit or the lodge's wood stove from dusk until at least 10 p.m. every night without exception. And the caretaker was prohibited from crossing the flagged boundary line on the northeast edge of the property, roughly 2 miles behind the lodge, described in the contract as the timber block, for any reason, at any time, day or night. And I called Sandra back and asked about that last one, expecting some story about a sinkhole or an old mine shaft, some liability thing. And she said only that the trees back there were old growth, unstable, prone to wind throw, and that a previous caretaker had gotten turned around in there once, and it had taken the county search and rescue 9 hours to find him. That explanation was thin enough that a smarter version of me would have hung up, and instead I signed it, scanned it, and emailed it back before 6 o'clock. And half the first month's pay hit my account 4 days later, $3,100, more money at once than I'd seen since I sold the Silverado. And I paid my mother's hospice bill down by $2,000 of it before I let myself think too hard about the rest. I drove up on the last day of October, a gray Friday, with the temperature sitting at 31 degrees and the first real snow of the season already dusting the ditches along Highway 1 as I made my way north. And about 4 miles south of the County Road 116 turnoff, there's a gas station and bait shop called Voyager Bait and Gas that I stopped at, out of habit more than need, topping off the tank before the gravel started. And the man behind the counter, heavy-set, 70 at least, wearing a Vikings cap gone soft with age, asked where I was headed the way gas station owners in small towns always do, making conversation while they ring you up. When I told him Redfern, he set my change down on the counter instead of my hand, which I noticed even before I noticed the look on his face. And he asked if I was sure about that. And I said I had a signed contract and a family that needed the money. And he nodded slow, like that answer settled something for him, and said his name was Gordy Nissen, and that he'd guided fishing parties out past Basswood for almost 40 years and hadn't taken a client anywhere near that stretch of country since 2010, not for any amount. And when I asked him why, half joking, he didn't laugh. He just said, "Keep something burning after dark, mister, every night, don't let it go low," and turned to help the next customer like the conversation was over. And I sat in my truck in that gravel lot for a minute afterward, turning that over. And then I told myself the way you tell yourself these things, that rural Minnesota was full of old men with old superstitions about the woods and pulled back onto the highway, and Ailey was the last town with a real grocery store. And I stopped at the IGA on Sheridan Street to load up on canned goods, batteries, and enough coffee to last a winter, and the checkout girl, maybe 19, rang me up without much interest until I mentioned I was headed out to Redfern for the winter. And something in her face changed, quick, like a door closing, and she asked if I was sure about that too, and when I asked why, she just shrugged and said her uncle used to guide fishing trips out that way and wouldn't go anymore, hadn't for years. And I wondered, driving out of town, if her uncle and Gordy Nissen were the same stubborn old guide, or if there were simply enough of them out there who'd learned the same lessons separately that it didn't matter. County Road 116 turned to gravel 2 miles past the last mailbox, and the access road to Redfern turned off that, unmarked except for a rusted iron gate standing open and a hand-painted sign nailed to a birch that just said Pierivate, and 11 miles of 2-track through second-growth aspen and then old spruce, climbing gently, the kind of road that ate an hour of daylight navigating the washouts, and by the time the lodge came into view, the sky had gone the pewter color it gets in the Northland an hour before an early sunset, and Redfern itself was bigger than I expected. A long log-built lodge with a stone chimney at each end, 2 smaller guest cabins set back toward the tree line, a pole barn, a woodshed stacked with what looked like 2 winters' worth of split birch and oak. And beyond all of it, past a mowed clearing that Sandra's paperwork called the yard, the tree line went dark and close in a way that second-growth forest doesn't. the spruce standing taller and closer together than anything I'd have expected on land that had been logged over in the 30s. And I want to be accurate about this, because it's the kind of thing that's easy to invent after the fact, once you know how a story ends. But I remember standing by my truck with the engine ticking and looking at that tree line and feeling something I can only describe as the woods looking back. Which is a stupid thing to write down and an even stupider thing to have felt on a Friday afternoon with groceries still in the truck bed, but I felt it, and I stood there a full minute before I made myself walk to the lodge door. And inside, the place was clean, well-kept, obviously used and cared for rather than mothballed, and there was a note on the kitchen table in neat handwriting from Sandra with instructions for the generator, and the well pump and the boundary flags, plus a laminated map of the property with the northeast timber block marked off in red hatching, the flag line running along a ridge about 2 miles back, following what the map labeled as an old skid trail from the logging days. And there was also, taped to the inside of the pantry door where I wouldn't see it until my second day, a single index card in different handwriting, older and more cramped, that said only, "Keep the fire lit, and don't answer if it uses a name you know. Signed only, PD." I assume the initials belonged to Perry Dunlop, the caretaker before me, and I remember reading that card and laughing a little. It struck me as the kind of joke a bored, isolated guy leaves behind for whoever comes next, the way people scrawl things on bathroom walls. And I did not take it as a warning, not yet. The first week was easy, in the way physical work is easy when you're grateful for it, and a skinny, half-starved yellow dog with a torn ear and no collar showed up at the pole barn on my third morning, November 2nd, and she hung back at first, and then I'd left a bowl of scraps out twice. She was willing to eat within 10 feet of me, and by the end of that week, she'd taken to sleeping on the lodge porch, and I'd started calling her Biscuit. Mostly because it was the first word that came out of my mouth the morning she let me touch her, and I split extra kindling, ran the generator on Sandra's schedule, and drove the plow truck over the access road after 4 inches fell on November 3rd, and I spent my evenings in front of the wood stove with a paperback, Biscuit curled against the hearth, and the radio picking up a scratchy AM signal out of Duluth. And I called my mother twice that week and Mabel once, on a Sunday, and told her about the lodge and the deer I'd seen from the kitchen window and the dog that had adopted me. And she asked if there were wolves, and I said probably. And she thought that was the best thing she'd ever heard. And for about 4 days I felt, for the first time in over a year, like a man whose life was pointed in a direction instead of falling. That was the week before things started going wrong. And I've turned it over enough times since to know that the wrongness didn't arrive all at once, and it leaked in. The first thing was the ravens. And Ailey country has ravens everywhere, big ones, loud ones. The kind that follow snowmobiles and raid dumpsters. And Redfern's clearing had a resident pair that croaked at each other from the pole barn roof every morning when I came out to check the generator. And on the morning of November 9th, they were gone. And they didn't come back, not that day. Not the next, not for the rest of the time I was there. And I noticed because the silence was strange in a way I couldn't place until I stood in the yard and listened and realized there were no birds at all, not chickadees, not the woodpeckers that had been hammering the dead popple all week. And nothing, and Biscuit noticed it too, in her own way, refusing that morning for the first time to follow me past the edge of the mowed grass. Sitting instead at the tree line's border with her ears flat and a low, steady whine in her throat that didn't stop until I called her back to the porch. And a boreal forest in November isn't loud, but it isn't dead either, and that morning it was dead, and it stayed that way, and I wrote it in the log Sandra wanted. Wildlife activity, nil. Unusually quiet, because I didn't know what else to call it. The second thing was the tracks, and on November 12th, after about 3 inches of fresh snow overnight, I walked the near part of the property to check the flag line closer to the lodge, a stretch about a quarter-mile back where the trail crossed a low, brushy drainage, and found a line of tracks crossing the trail that stopped me cold, and they were bipedal, which was the first wrong thing, spaced in a long, uneven stride, closer to 5 feet between prints than the 2.5 feet a man's stride runs. And the prints themselves were long and narrow, nearly 18 inches by my boot laid alongside one of them, with an odd dragging smear at the heel like whatever made them didn't fully lift its feet, And I've tracked deer, moose, wolf, and bear through that country for years working trail crews. And I know what a bear's rear print looks like when it's walking upright through brush, elongated and human-seeming enough to spook tourists every fall. And I told myself that's what I was looking at. A black bear that hadn't denned yet, moving strange through the snow. And I took 3 photos on my phone which had no signal to send them anywhere. And I followed the tracks for maybe 80 yards before they angled off toward the northeast, toward the flag line, and I stopped there because the contract said stop there and because, if I'm honest, I didn't want to keep walking that line another step. And 2 days later, on the 14th, I found a smear of something dark, half frozen, on the porch railing that hadn't been there the evening before, thin and rust-colored, and Biscuit wouldn't come within 10 feet of it. And I scrubbed it off with snow and a rag before I let myself think too hard about what it might have been. That night, I built the fire up bigger than usual and sat in front of the wood stove until almost midnight, telling myself the whole time I wasn't waiting for anything. I heard it for the first time 4 nights later, November 16th, a Monday, and I'd gone to bed around 11 with the fire banked low and the generator off, the lodge running quiet on the battery bank, and I woke sometime after 1 in the morning to a sound that took me a long moment to place, because it didn't match anything I had a category for, and it was a clicking high and fast, layered under a low, wet exhale, like something breathing through a chest full of fluid, coming from somewhere close to the north wall of the lodge, maybe 30 feet out, where the yard gave way to brush. And Biscuit, sleeping at the foot of my bed by then, came awake at the same moment I did. Every muscle rigid and did not bark, did not growl, just pressed herself flat against the mattress and shook. And I lay still and listened for what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably 2, and the sound moved, slow, tracking along the wall toward the kitchen end of the building, and then it stopped, and there was a long silence. And then 3 deliberate knocks against the exterior wall, evenly spaced, like knuckles on a door, except the wall there had no door. And I did not get up. And I want to be honest that I did not get up. That I lay in that bed with my heart going and my hand on the flashlight on the nightstand, and did not go look, because some animal part of my brain that I'd never had reason to listen to before was telling me with total certainty that whatever was on the other side of that log wall was not something I wanted to see, and that being seen looking would be worse than not looking at all. And the knocking didn't come again, and sometime before dawn I fell back asleep, and in the morning I found 3 parallel scores in the frost on the outside of the window glass, nearest where the knocking had stopped, too high up for anything on 4 legs to have made. And I told myself in the flat gray light with coffee in my hand that it had probably been a bear working the exterior wall for insulation or grubs, even though I already half knew otherwise. That black bears in mid-November in that part of Minnesota are denned up or denning soon, sluggish and uninterested in anything but sleep, not clicking and breathing and knocking on walls at 1 in the morning. I made my one approved supply run on November 30th, the day my second half payment hit my account, driving the 11 miles out with a list Sandra had never actually followed up on, and a growing itch to talk to another human being who wasn't at the other end of a satellite delay. And Gordy Nissen was behind the counter at Voyager when I stopped for gas. And this time, maybe because I looked as rattled as I felt, he didn't let me walk out with a shrug, and he asked straight out if I'd heard anything yet. And when I told him about the sound on the wall, he set down the rag he'd been wiping the counter with. And his grandfather, a Finn who'd worked timber camps around Basswood as a young man, used to tell him there was a stretch of country east of the lake that the old Ojibwe families wouldn't hunt and the old lumberjacks wouldn't cut. And it wasn't because the land was bad, he said, but because something had happened on it that the land itself hadn't forgotten, and that his grandfather called it, in the mangled half-English, half-Finnish of a man who'd learned the story secondhand, the hungry man, and said the hungry man could sound like anybody you loved and would, sooner or later, if you let it keep talking to you long enough. And I asked him if he thought that was out there, expecting the kind of shrug you give when you're repeating a story you don't quite believe, and Gordy Nissen's face did something I hadn't expected, a kind of controlled stillness settling over it. And he told me about his nephew Petey, 19 years old in November of 1994, out for opening weekend of deer season on a lease less than 3 miles from what I now knew was the Redfern boundary, who'd gone still hunting alone at first light and never come back to camp. And how the search that followed, 4 days of volunteers and county SAR dogs that Gordy himself had walked every mile of, had turned up nothing, not a rifle, not a brute print, past the second day. And nothing at all, as though the boy had simply stopped existing somewhere in that timber. And how the official report had settled, in the end, on exposure and misadventure because there was nothing else to write down that a county report form had a box for. And Gordy said he didn't think it, he knew it, and that knowing it was the reason he hadn't set foot past the Basswood Portage in over a decade no matter what a client offered to pay him. And that he still kept Petey's hunting license, expired now 30 years, folded in his wallet behind his own, because it was the last piece of paper with the boy's name on it that anybody had handed back to the family. And I drove back to Redfern that afternoon with his voice in my head the whole way. And Sandra Voss's line rang through to voicemail twice more before I gave up trying for the week. I called Sandra on my next scheduled check-in, Friday the 20th, using the satellite phone she'd left for exactly that purpose, and I told her about the tracks and the sound, trying to keep my voice level, framing it as a wildlife report because that's what she'd asked for. And there was a pause on the line longer than the satellite delay accounted for, and when she spoke again her voice had a careful, rehearsed quality to it. And she asked if I was keeping the fire lit every night like the contract specified. And I said yes, and she said good. Keep doing that, and if the sounds continue, don't go outside after dark, and don't respond to anything that calls your name. And I asked her what exactly she meant by that, and she said only that the woods up there had a reputation. That her husband's family had dealt with poachers and trespassers over the decades who liked to mess with the caretakers, and that the safest thing was always to stay inside, keep the fire going, and wait for morning. When I pushed her on that, asking why a poacher would know to call me by my mother's pet name for me, which I hadn't used yet and hadn't told anyone, she went quiet in a way that felt less like satellite lag and more like someone choosing her next words very carefully. And she said, in a voice that had lost its cardigan and pearls composure just slightly, that she really did have to go. That her husband needed her, and the line went dead before I could ask anything else. And it was a bad explanation, and I knew it was a bad explanation, and I knew it was a bad explanation even as she gave it, the kind of thing that answers the letter of a question while dodging the spirit of it completely. But I had $2,000 of my mother's medical debt still on my mind, and a paycheck due in 9 days. And I told myself I could live with a strange noise in exchange for that kind of money. The way people talk themselves into all sorts of arrangements when they need the arrangement to work. I started digging on my own after that, mostly out of the same restlessness that used to make me pull maintenance logs apart on slow days at the Forest Service, wanting to understand a system rather than just operate inside it blind. And there was a locked tool shed behind the pole barn that Sandra's instructions hadn't mentioned. And on November 23rd, looking for a spare fuel filter, I found the key on a nail inside the barn and let myself in. And it wasn't tools, and it was a caretaker's archive, 4 decades of it, cardboard boxes gone soft, with damp holding logbooks, receipts, a few photographs, and in the back, wrapped in a garbage bag to keep the mice out. And a stack of spiral notebooks that turned out to be journals kept by at least 6 different caretakers going back to 1979, and I sat on an overturned bucket in that shed with a headlamp on until my hands went numb from the cold reading, and I did not sleep that night at all. The earliest journal, from a man who signed himself only as R. Kellerman, described almost exactly what I'd already experienced in my first 3 weeks. The birds vanishing, tracks in the snow crossing near the flag line, and a knocking on the walls at night that escalated over the winter from occasional to nightly. And Kellerman's entries grew shorter and more erratic through January and February of that first winter 1979 into 1980. And one entry from mid-February described finding his own woodpile rearranged overnight into a shape he refused to describe as anything but wrong, deliberate, like a message he didn't want translated. And another entry, from February 27th, described a night the knocking had been accompanied for the first time by a voice repeating his late father's last words to him. And the last entry, dated March 2nd, read only, in handwriting nothing like the careful print of his earlier pages. It knows Diane's voice now. It called for her outside the kitchen window at 2 in the morning. And it was her. It was exactly her. and Diane has been dead 6 years, and there was no entry after that. And a newspaper clipping in the back of the notebook, yellowed and brittle, was from the Ely Miner dated the 14th of March 1980, reporting a caretaker at a private hunting property northeast of town had been reported missing by his employer. It said search and rescue had covered the property and surrounding forest for 5 days without result, and that the case remained open, and I read that clipping 3 times before I understood I was sitting in the same shed, on the same property, that Kellerman had walked out of 46 years earlier and never walked back into. The other journals told variations on the same story, spaced roughly 8 to 10 years apart, which I later understood was not the frequency of the caretaker position turning over, but the frequency of something else entirely, and something closer to a cycle. And a young couple, Mark and Terry Solheim, who signed their entries jointly through the winter of 1988, lasted less than 2 months. Their early pages full of the same practical, almost cheerful detail mine had started with: generator hours, and a good day of ice fishing on the property's little unnamed lake, and their notebook ending mid-sentence on January 6th, with the handwriting trailing off into an unfinished word. We heard it say the kids' names and we don't even no period, nothing after. And a separate note from Sandra's own father-in-law tucked loose in the same box, confirming only that the Solheims had departed the property unexpectedly and forfeited their remaining wages. Language close enough to the clause I'd signed myself that reading it made my stomach drop. And a solitary trapper named Elmer Kask, who wintered at Redfern in 1996 running his trap line along the property's edges in exchange for the arrangement, kept the tears more practical account of the bunch, noting kill sites and weather for weeks before his entries turned. And Kask had apparently tried his own version of what I would later attempt myself, marking his trapline sets with strips of red cloth well inside the flag boundary, and burning a second fire at the edge of his cabin's clearing every night starting in mid-January. And his entries through early February had a grim, practical confidence to them. The fires holding it stayed at the flags twice tonight, and it wouldn't cross. That confidence made his collapse 2 weeks later land harder on the page. A man who had believed his own countermeasures were working up until they weren't, and his last legible line, dated deep in February, read, "It's not an animal. Animals don't apologize," followed by a page of handwriting so degraded it might have been a different person entirely. And it ended in a scrawl that a folded page in the back of the notebook, in a different hand, identified only as recovered from the timber block by County SAR, March 1996, deceased not located. The longest and most careful account came from a woman named Josephine Reyes, a wildlife biologist by training who'd taken the caretaker job in 2009 for reasons her notebook made clear were almost identical to mine, a grant that had fallen through and a stack of bills that hadn't. And she'd done what I was now doing, digging into the property's history, and she'd gone further than any of the others. Methodical the way a scientist is methodical about the thing that's going to kill her. And she'd found, tucked into the false bottom of a strong box in the same shed I was sitting in, a set of much older documents, and she'd transcribed the relevant parts into her own notebook in small, careful print before returning the originals. And it was her transcription I read by headlamp, shaking from more than cold. According to what Josephine Reyes had found, Redfern had been a logging camp before it was anything else, run by the Voss Timber Company out of a base camp the loggers called Camp 7, operating through the winter of 1936 into 1937. And one of the hardest winters on regional record, weeks of temperatures never climbing above zero, and snow that closed the supply road for a stretch of 11 days in January, and a resupply sled that was supposed to reach the camp on January 19th never arrived, lost or turned back in a storm. And the camp's foreman, a man named Josiah Voss, made the call to keep working rather than risk the 22-mile trek out on foot, believing the road would clear before food ran out, and it didn't clear in time. And by early February, the camp's provisions were gone, down to what Reyes's transcription called flour paste and boiled bark. And by the time a relief party finally broke through on February 24th, only 9 of the 16 men who'd wintered at Camp 7 were still alive. And Reyes had copied out the names of the 7 who weren't, from a payroll ledger she'd found alongside the relief foreman's account. Axel Berg, Thomas Ogenpa, a man listed only as Frenchie LaCroix, Harold Nyquist, 2 brothers named Dale and Ray Torvik, and a 19-year-old camp cook named Emil Suomi, the youngest of the crew, and the relief party's own foreman, whose account Reyes had transcribed nearly word for word, wrote that the survivors were in poor shape, thin beyond anything hunger alone explained in 5 weeks. The survivors were unwilling to discuss what had happened to the 7 missing men, beyond insisting, all of them, unprompted and separately, that the men had simply wandered off into the timber and not come back, and this had happened one at a time, over 3 weeks, always at night, always after the man had been the last one awake by the fire. And the relief foreman's account ended with a line Reyes had underlined twice in her own notebook. Voss would not meet my eyes when I asked him about it, and there is something in that camp now that was not there before, and I do not believe it will leave when the men do. Josiah Voss did not die that winter, and he lived, according to property records Reyes had also dug up, until 1971, and the Voss family kept the land, first as a logging concern and then, once the pine was gone, as the private hunting retreat it became by the 1960s. And somewhere in that transition, a pattern had set in that Reyes's notebook, laid out plainly enough that I didn't need her to spell it further, every 8 to 10 years. And the family hired a live-in caretaker for the winter months, always someone in financial distress, always offered pay far beyond what the job should command, always bound by a contract with the same 3 unusual clauses I'd signed myself: the fire, the boundary, the isolation. And every 8 to 10 years, without fail, since at least 1979, and likely, Reyes believed, going back to Josiah Voss's own lifetime, something happened to that caretaker before spring, and some left early, shaken, unwilling to say why, and some, like Kellerman, did not leave at all. And Reyes's own notebook ended on a page dated February 2010, 4 months into her stay, with a passage that I read 3 times in that cold shed, and have not been able to stop hearing in her handwriting since. I think the fire and the boundary line aren't there to protect the caretaker, and I think they're there to define the trade. As long as someone stays inside the line and keeps the fire lit, it stays out there, and the town stays safe, and the Voss family keeps their land and never has to explain why half their caretakers disappear. And I think we are not being protected, and I think we are bait that occasionally gets recalled early enough to still be alive. And I am leaving in the morning, whether or not it's my approved supply run, and I do not know if I will make it to the truck. There was a newspaper clipping behind that page too, dated March 2010, reporting that a 31-year-old woman employed as a seasonal caretaker at a private property outside Ely had been found alive but severely disoriented 11 miles from the property along County Road 116. And she was suffering from exposure and unable to give investigators a coherent account of how she'd gotten there, and no criminal activity was suspected, and there was no further clipping after that. And I don't know if Josephine Reyes ever spoke about what happened to her, or if she did and no one believed her. And I only know that she made it out, which by that shed's own math put her ahead of at least 2 of the caretakers whose journals I'd just read, and that even making it out hadn't been enough to stop the Voss family from doing this again, and again, on a schedule, for close to a century. The last thing I found in that shed was the thing that finally made the whole arrangement feel less like folklore and more like paperwork. And at the very bottom of the strong box, under the false bottom Reyes had pried up once, was a second, older ledger, bound in cracked black leather. And its first entries were dated in a spidery hand to 1938, the year after Camp 7, and it was a list, nothing more, 2 columns, a name and a season, running continuously down page after page in different handwriting as the decades passed. And it was clearly maintained and added to by whoever in the Voss family currently held the property, a bookkeeping of caretakers going back to a man named Axel Torvald in the winter of 1938. The very first name after Josiah Voss's own. That name was marked in the margin with a single word, recalled. And most names carried some version of that same word, recalled or terminated early or departed. The family's own bloodless language for a caretaker who'd gotten out alive, and a smaller number, 7 of them by my count, before my hands started shaking too badly to keep counting carefully, carried a different word instead, unresolved. And I recognized 3 of those names from the journals already spread open around me on the shed floor, and Kellerman was among them. And a 4th I didn't recognize at all was a name from decades before any of the journals I'd found. Axel Torvald himself, crossed out and rewritten, as unresolved in ink that looked decades newer than the entry beside it. And it looked as though someone had gone back, much later, and corrected the record once the truth of that first winter finally caught up with the paperwork, which told me this ledger was still being kept, updated, watched over by someone in that family even now. And there, on the last use page, in Sandra Voss's own careful, familiar handwriting, the same hand from the note she'd left me on the kitchen table my first afternoon, was my name. Cole Algren, Winter, current year, and the outcome column beside it had been left blank, waiting, the way I understood every other blank in that column must have waited once, for somebody to eventually fill it in. And I sat there a long time just looking at my own name on that page. 2 days after that first night in the shed, some stubborn, half-sick curiosity made me pull the laminated property map off the office wall and compare it against the hand-drawn sketch tucked into Reyes's notebook, and one she'd made herself, marking the approximate location of the original Camp 7 bunkhouse foundation, close enough to the near edge of the flag line that a man could reach it and still, technically, stay inside the boundary the contract required. And I went out to find it on November 25th, telling myself I needed the closure of seeing it more than I needed to stay away, and I found what was left about 100 yards short of the flags themselves. A rectangle of moss-grown fieldstone foundation barely knee-high in places, and a collapsed iron stove half swallowed by duff and rusted logging equipment. A cant hook, the toothed wheel of some winch mechanism, scattered through the brush the way things get scattered by 90 years of freeze and thaw, rather than by anyone tidying up after themselves. And near the foundation's northeast corner, half buried and easy to miss if I hadn't already been looking hard at the ground, I found a low cairn of fieldstones, deliberate, not the kind of pile Frostheave makes, and driven into the ground behind it, rotted nearly to pulp but legible where the wood had been protected under an overhanging stone. A wooden marker with 7 names scratched into it by a hand that hadn't been a trained carpenter. The same 7 names Reyes had copied from the payroll ledger. And Berg, Ojanpa, Lacroix, Nyquist, the Torbeck brothers, and Emil Suomi at the bottom, younger than the rest, and beneath his name, cut deeper than the others as though whoever carved it had pressed harder. 3 words I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Forgive us, please. And I did not stay there long, and I remember the particular quality of the cold in that clearing, sharper than it had any right to be given the wind. And I remember Biscuit, who had followed me that far and no farther. Refusing outright to cross into the foundation's footprint at all, sitting instead at its edge with her ears back until I came away. And I remember walking back to the lodge faster than the distance required, telling myself it was only the temperature dropping with the sun. I sat in that shed until the cold finally drove me back to the lodge, sometime past 3 in the morning, and I built the fire up until it was roaring, and I did not sleep, and in the morning I called Sandra Voss on the satellite phone with every intention of quitting on the spot. And she didn't answer, and I tried 4 more times that day and twice the next and got nothing but a generic voicemail that never called back. And it was only on the 3rd day, going through the paperwork drawer in the lodge office looking for another contact number, that I found a clause I'd apparently skimmed past in the original 11 pages, stating that early termination by the caretaker forfeited all compensation already paid, retroactively, recoverable by Voss Holdings through the security deposit and wage garnishment provisions outlined in Exhibit C, which I had signed without reading closely enough, $3,100 of which was gone into my mother's hospital account and could not be unspent. And I remember standing in that office with the paper in my hand doing the math you do when you're desperate, welling a nummy, and deciding, God help me, that I could last through December if I kept the fire lit and stayed inside the flag line like Reyes and Kellerman and all the others had been told to do, and that I would use my one approved supply trip at the end of the month to figure out a way off the property that didn't cost me money I didn't have. I drove into Ellie 3 days early, on December 19th, telling myself I'd claim car trouble if Sandra ever surfaced to complain, though by then I suspected she wasn't going to surface at all, that the silence since my shed discovery was its own kind of answer. And I went to the Ellie Public Library first, and then, on the librarian's suggestion, to the Northeastern Minnesota Historical Society archive, housed in the back of the Vermilion Community College building, where a research volunteer named Arlene Pelagia, who looked to be somewhere in her 70s and had clearly been doing this a long time, pulled microfilm reels of the alien miner going back to the 1930s without asking many questions once I told her the property name. And she found the Camp 7 story faster than I expected, which told me I wasn't the first person to come asking. And when I said so, she admitted, carefully, that a woman had come through in 2010 asking the same questions, and a man before that in the late 90s, and that she'd started keeping a small file of her own out of what she called professional curiosity, which she retrieved from a drawer and let me read at the table without checking it out. Arlene's file confirmed the broad shape of what Reyes had transcribed but added something Reyes's notebook hadn't had access to. A 1937 report filed by the Minnesota State Forester who'd investigated Camp 7's provisioning failure, in which he noted, almost as an aside, that Josiah Voss had petitioned the county that spring to have the northeast section of the logging tract, roughly the same acreage marked on my own laminated map as the timber block, permanently excluded from further harvest, citing unstable ground, and a request the county granted without much scrutiny since the pine there had already been high-graded and wasn't worth much anyway, and the same forester's report noted, almost in passing, that Voss had arranged at his own expense for a bonded fire watch to be maintained on that section of the property in perpetuity, a phrase that meant nothing to the forester filing the paperwork in 1937 and meant everything to me reading it by fluorescent library light 89 years later. And Arlene had also found, in a box of unpublished local history interviews conducted in the 1970s by a college folklore student, a transcript of an interview with an elderly Ojibwe trapper named Wilfred Natshaikawamigukwe, who had worked the country north of Bailey his whole life and who, when the interviewer asked about old stories from around Basswood and the Kawashiri country, had talked at length in a manner the transcript described as reluctant and precise about the Windigo, and a being his grandmother had warned him about as a boy, born, she'd told him, not as an animal that existed on its own, but as what a person became when starvation and desperation drove them to eat another person to survive. And a spirit of hunger with no bottom to it that grew larger the more it consumed and was never, ever satisfied. Its heart turned to ice, its hunger the only thing about it that stayed human-sized while the rest of it grew and grew. And Wilfred said his grandmother taught him it could imitate the voices of the dead and the living, both to lure the unwary, that it could not cross a boundary properly marked and maintained, that fire held real power against it, and that it was drawn most strongly to places where the crime that birthed it had happened, returning to feed near that ground and again across generations, its hunger renewing itself the way a wound scars over and then reopens. And Wilfred had told the interviewer, according to the transcript, that his grandmother's generation knew of at least one such place east of Basswood Lake tied to a bad winter among the loggers, and that Ojibwe families had avoided that stretch of country for as long as anyone could remember, well before the Voss Company ever cut a tree there, and that white men naming it a hunting camp hadn't changed what the ground was, and that as far as he knew nobody had ever managed to kill one, only ever managed, for a while, to keep it fed enough and far enough back that it left the rest of the world alone. And the interviewer had pushed him, according to the transcript, on whether he meant this literally or as a kind of teaching story, the way an outsider trained to sort folklore from fact would, and Wilfred's answer, which Arlene read out loud to me at the archive table in a voice that had gone flatter and more careful than anything she'd said all afternoon, was that his people had never needed the distinction the interviewer was asking for, that a story could be true and be the kind of true you were meant to carry as a warning than a fact to argue about, and that the white loggers who'd come through that country a generation before him had learned the same lesson the hard way without asking his grandmother's permission to learn it. And he'd also said something Arlene hadn't found anywhere else in her file, that the hunger was said to be patient in a specific way, willing to let a man go once if it had reason to believe he'd come back, or send someone back in his place, and that the worst thing a person could do, worse than answering when it called, was to feed it steadily enough, year after year, that it never had to go looking for its own meals at all, because a fed thing that never has to hunt for itself doesn't shrink the way hunger is supposed to shrink when it's satisfied, and it grows patient instead, and it waits better. And reading that back now, months later, with the Voss family's ledger and its 88 years of scheduled caretakers sitting in my memory next to it. And I don't think Wilfred Nassaikiwamikukwi was talking about an abstraction at all. And I think he was describing in the careful, indirect way his grandmother had taught him to describe it. And the exact arrangement I'd unknowingly signed myself into on a Tuesday morning outside an unemployment office. And I think the Voss family's 90 years of quiet, well-fed patience is the reason that thing is stronger now, not weaker, than it was in 1937. Arlene made one more call before I left that afternoon to a friend of hers who clerked at the Lake County Recorder's office and came back 20 minutes later with a photocopied list that put a harder edge on everything I'd already read. And a list of missing persons and unresolved death filings tied to the general vicinity of the old Camp 7 tract going back to 1937. Not just caretakers, but hunters, hikers, 2 Boy Scouts on a 1962 canoe trip who'd wandered from camp and never been found, and a snowmobiler in 1975, a bow hunter in 2003, 11 names in total across 80-plus years, spaced unevenly but clustering when I laid the dates against the caretaker turnover Reyes had already mapped, around the same 8 to 10-year rhythm, as though whatever was out there fed steadily in small ways between the larger, more deliberate meals the Voss family's arrangement provided. And I sat in that archive room until it closed at 4:30. And Arlene, locking up behind me, asked, in a tone that had dropped the careful neutrality she'd used all afternoon, if I was still planning on going back out there, and I told her I didn't see how I couldn't. Not with $30,100 of my mother's medical debt riding on it and a garnishment clause I couldn't afford to trigger. And she looked at me for a long moment and then wrote a phone number on a scrap of paper, her own home number, and told me to call her any hour if I made it to a phone and needed someone to come get me, and that she meant that exactly as seriously as it sounded. And I drove back to Redfern with that scrap of paper on the passenger seat, and the last of the daylight gone by the time I hit the access road, and I remember thinking, with a kind of hollow, exhausted clarity, that I now understood exactly what I was inside of. It was a machine the Voss family had been running for 90 years, trading desperate people for a wintering thing's continued hunger in exchange for keeping it far enough from town that nobody with power ever had to reckon with it directly. And understanding the machine hadn't given me a way out of it, only a clearer view of the walls. The week that followed, the last full week before Christmas, was the one I keep going back to in my head when I try to pin down exactly how a person stays somewhere they already understand is trying to kill them. Because on paper that week looked almost ordinary, and that ordinariness is its own kind of horror I hadn't expected, and I still had to eat, so I cooked, and I still had to keep the lodge from freezing. So I split wood and fed the stove and checked the pipes twice a day the way the job actually required, and I still wrote the weekly log Sandro boss was never going to read. Wildlife activity elevated, unable to specify. Because some stubborn clerical part of me refused to stop keeping the record after I'd stopped believing anyone on the other end cared, and Biscuit slept against my legs every one of those nights. And I remember specifically how normal Wednesday the 17th felt. Coffee, wood splitting, and a card game of solitaire at the kitchen table with the radio playing carols out of a Duluth station that came in only after dark, and how that normalcy made the low knock against the north wall at 10:30 feel survivable. Background noise to a life I was still, somehow, trying to live inside of. And I wrote in my own notebook that Wednesday night, in handwriting I recognized as still fully mine, that I thought I could make it to April if nothing changed. And I believed it when I wrote it. And 4 days later, nothing about my life out there would ever again feel that survivable. Biscuit didn't come to meet the truck that evening the way she had every evening for 6 weeks, and I found her 2 days later on December 21st at the edge of the mowed yard nearest the tree line, and I am not going to describe what was left of her beyond saying that it wasn't the work of wolves or coyotes, that there was too much of her simply arranged rather than eaten, laid out the way the deer carcass on the flag trail had been laid out weeks earlier. Organs set aside in a neat row like something being cataloged rather than consumed, and that I dug a hole for her in ground so frozen it took me most of the afternoon in both hands blistering through my gloves, and that I did not cry until I was most of the way through, and that the crying turned, somewhere in the last few shovelfuls, into a low, furious kind of resolve that scared me almost as much as the grief had. A decision forming somewhere under the exhaustion that I was not simply going to sit inside that lodge for 3 more months waiting my turn, Christmas came and went with the sat phone still dead to any outgoing call reaching Sandra Voss. 3 attempts a week logged in my caretaker notebook out of a stubbornness I can't fully explain. Maybe just wanting a record that I'd tried. And the pattern from Race's notebook and Kellerman's before was holding true in mine now too. The entries growing shorter, more repetitive, structured entirely around fire, boundary, don't answer, fire, boundary, don't answer. And I caught myself twice reading back through what I'd written and not recognizing the handwriting as fully my own. Tighter and more cramped than it used to be. The way Kellerman's had gone in his last weeks, and the propane company that serviced the lodge's tank, a 2-man outfit out of tower that Sandra's paperwork listed as prepaid through April, missed its scheduled mid-December delivery entirely, and when I finally raised someone on the sat phone to ask about it, a tired-sounding man who identified himself only as Kurt told me, in the clipped tone of someone reciting a decision made well above his pay grade, that the company had reevaluated servicing that access road for the rest of the season, and that a refund would be issued to the account holder. And when I pushed for a reason, he said only that his driver had refused 2 winters running now, and he wasn't going to make the man do it a third, and hung up before I could ask which driver or why. And the generator quit on the morning of December 30th, not from any fuel problem I could find, but from a fuel line I found split clean through in a spot no rodent could have reached, and no wear pattern explained. And I spent that whole short gray afternoon splicing it with electrical tape and prayer, rationing the battery bank after that, running lights only in the kitchen and only after dark, and telling myself the whole time that a split fuel line was just old rubber failing in the cold. And the same way I'd told myself the blood on the porch railing was nothing. The same way I'd told myself the ravens leaving was nothing. Each explanation a little thinner than the last and costing a little more to believe. On January 3rd, it called Mabel's voice for the first time. A 6-year-old's voice, my daughter's voice, from just past the porch steps at 11 at night. Daddy, I'm scared, it's dark, and I have never in my life wanted to do anything as badly as I wanted to open that door. And I got as far as the latch again, hand shaking, before I made myself say out loud to the empty kitchen, Mabel is in Rochester with her mother. Mabel is in Rochester with her mother, until the words meant more than the sound outside did, and I did not open the door. And I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets until the voice gave up sometime near 2, and the knocking started instead, slower now, heavier, working its way around toward the wood stove flue, as if it had learned, over the weeks, exactly where the heat left the building. And I saw it in daylight for the first time 4 days later, and January 7th, a little past 3 in the afternoon with maybe 40 minutes of real light left, standing motionless at the tree line where the yard gave way to brush. And it was tall and wrong-jointed and gray-yellow against the white snow, not moving. Watching the lodge the way I imagine I'd been watching the tree line all along, without ever seeing it. Watch back, and the fact that it would show itself in daylight now, when every warning in every journal in that shed had implied the fire and the dark were the terms it operated under, told me more than anything else, had that whatever schedule this thing kept, whatever patience it had been exercising, was running out. I spent the next 2 days doing everything Wilfred Nasiki Wimagukwi's interview and the journals combined had suggested might matter. Most of it half-remembered folk practice I had no reel to be improvising and knew it as I did it, driven by the particular desperation of a man with no better ideas left. And I burned cedar boughs in a coffee can on the porch until the whole clearing smelled like a sweat lodge, because Wilfred had mentioned cedar smoke as something his grandmother's generation trusted. And I dragged the wood stove's cold ash out in buckets and laid a rough line of it across the porch steps and both windowsills, because a boundary properly marked and maintained was the phrase that kept surfacing in my head from that transcript, and ash was the only boundary material I had in any quantity. And I moved every fire I could manage, the wood stove, a second pit dug in the yard, a third small campfire on the porch itself, so that no approach to the lodge crossed open ground without passing something lit. And I want to be honest, that I don't know whether any of it did a single thing, whether the 2 quiet nights that followed, January 7th into the 9th, were the result of ash lines and cedar smoke, or the ordinary lull of a thing content to let a man exhaust himself with rituals before it came anyway. And I've never found anything in 6 more months of reading everything I could find on Windigo folklore that tells me which. And what I do know is that on the night it finally came to the door, Every fire I'd lit was burning, the ash line was still down, and none of it kept the door shut. The confrontation I still can't think about without my hands going cold no matter how warm the room is happened on the night of January 9th. And the fire had burned low sometime after midnight. My fault. And I'd fallen asleep in the chair beside the stove from exhaustion that had been building for weeks. And I woke to a cold room and a silence that felt wrong in the specific way silence had started feeling wrong out there. Too complete, pressurized. And the kitchen door, which I'd bolted, stood open 6 inches, snow blown across the threshold in a thin drift, and standing in that gap, close enough that I could see it clearly in the dying orange light of the stove, was something roughly the height and rough shape of a very tall, very thin man. If a man's proportions had been stretched and starved down to something closer to bone architecture than flesh. Skin the gray-yellow of old tallow drawn tight over a frame with too many visible joints. And a head slightly too large for the neck beneath it, and no fire threw enough light for me to see its face clearly, which even now, all these months later, I am grateful for, because the parts I did see, a mouth that hung open too far and didn't close right, and eyes that caught the firelight the flat, sourceless way an animal's do at night, were more than enough. And it did not rush me. That was almost the worst part, that it simply stood in the doorway, unhurried, and made a sound low in its chest, and a kind of grinding, hungry exhale, and said, in my mother's voice again, perfectly, terribly her, Coleman, why won't you let me in? I've been so cold, and I understood in that moment with total and immediate clarity that the voice was not an attempt to fool me anymore, not really, that it knew I knew, and that it was doing it anyway because the doing of it was itself a kind of feeding, some slower hunger being fed by my fear even as it stood there rather than by whatever it would do to me if I let it cross that threshold. I don't remember deciding to move, and I remember the poker from the wood stove tool set in my hand, and I remember shoving 3 fresh split logs into the stove's open door and slamming it. And I remember screaming something, not words, just noise, and swinging the poker in a wide arc, more to put something solid between us than out of any real belief it would do damage. And the thing recoiled from the stove door as it swung open and firelight spilled harder into the room, flinching back from the light in a way that told me. And later, once I could think again, that fire mattered to it exactly the way Perry Dunlop's card and every journal in that shed had said it did. Not as a weapon exactly, but as a boundary of its own, a thing it would not cross while lit. And it withdrew back through the doorway, into the dark, slow, unhurried again, almost contemptuous of my scrambling, and the last thing I heard before I got the door slammed and bolted and shoved the kitchen table against it. For good measure was that same grinding voice, and no longer my mother's, no longer anyone's I recognized, low and wet and final, saying something that I have turned over every day since without ever being sure I heard it right, though I believe I did soon. And I built that fire up until it roared loud enough to drown my own breathing, and I sat against the barricaded door until first light and in the gray of that morning, checking the porch. And I found a smear of something dark and viscous on the door frame at roughly shoulder height for whatever had stood there, and 3 long gouges in the log wall beside the door, parallel deep enough that I could lay 3 fingers into each one to the second knuckle. And my own hands were in worse shape than I'd registered in the moment. 2 fingernails torn from gripping the poker and the table edge hard enough to split them. A burn across my left palm I didn't remember getting from where I'd shoved the stove door shut barehanded. And a bruise blooming dark along my ribs by that afternoon that I could only guess came from throwing my own body against the barricaded kitchen table sometime in the small hours, adrenaline having scrubbed the specific memory of it clean even while it left the evidence behind. And I didn't sleep the rest of that day either, not really. Just sat wrapped in every blanket in the lodge, in the one chair that faced both the front door and the kitchen door at once, watching the tree line through the window go from gray to white to gray again. And somewhere in that long, hollowed-out stretch of watching, the decision that had started forming over Biscuit's grave finished forming completely, quiet and absolute in a way panic never manages to be, and I was not spending another night in that building. I called Arlene Pilaja that day on the sat phone, which for whatever reason connected to her number when it hadn't connected to Sandra's in weeks, and I told her as calmly as I could manage, that I needed to get off that property and that I was afraid the road out wasn't going to be simple. And she said she'd come get me herself if I could reach the county road, that she'd be waiting at the gate on County Road 1016 anytime I could make it, and no questions, and that if I couldn't make the drive to call her back, and she'd call the sheriff regardless of how it sounded, and I packed what I could carry in under 10 minutes. Cash, the sat phone, Reyes's notebook and Kellerman's, which I'd taken from the shed without really deciding to, and every photograph I'd managed to take of the tracks, and I got in the truck a little after 2 in the afternoon, wanting daylight on my side for as much of the drive as I could manage. I made it about 4 miles, which is a distance I have measured out on a map more times than I can count, since 4 miles that felt at the time like it should have counted for something, like it should have put enough of the property behind me to matter. The access road, which I had plowed clear myself only 3 days earlier, was blocked by 2 mature spruce, easily 60 feet each, fallen directly across the 2-track in an X pattern that no wind event I'd have slept through could have caused, and their root balls torn up clean rather than snapped. The kind of thing that happens when something with real strength pushes a tree over, rather than something breaking it in a storm. And I sat in the idling truck, staring at that blockage for a long time. And then I did the only thing I could think to do, which was get out and start trying to cut a way around it through the brush on foot, hauling what I could carry, because staying in that truck in failing light 2 miles from the boundary line felt like the worst of 2 bad options. And the light went fast that time of year, full dark by 5. And I want to be honest that somewhere in that stretch of forest, exhausted, half frozen, pushing through brush with a headlamp beam that felt smaller and smaller against the dark pressing in around it, and I lost the trail I'd been following, and lost, for a while, any real sense of which direction the county road actually lay in. And about 40 minutes into that, my headlamp caught something pale half buried in a drift-off to my right, and it took my mind a full 3 or 4 seconds longer than it should have to understand I was looking at the sun-bleached curve of a human ribcage, old, the snow around it undisturbed and settled in a way that told me it had been there through more than one winter. And I did not stop to look closer, and I have wondered every day since whether I'd just found Kellerman or Elmer Cask or someone whose name never made it into any journal at all. And I have decided I would rather not know for certain. And not 10 minutes past that, close enough that I felt the change in the air before I heard anything, the brush to my left went silent in that same pressurized, complete way the yard had gone silent back in November. And I froze with a headlamp beam shaking across a wall of black spruce and heard very close, close enough to feel like breath on the back of my neck, though nothing touched me, that same wet, clicking exhale from the kitchen doorway. And I ran, not carefully, not choosing a bearing anymore, just running, branches tearing at my jacket and my face, until I came out into a small clearing and nearly went down a shallow embankment I hadn't seen in the dark, catching myself hard enough on a birch trunk to tear the skin across my palm. And when I got the headlamp back under control, the brush behind me was still and empty and silent, and I could not have said, and still can't, whether it had actually closed that distance, or whether raw terror had simply made the woods feel closer than they were. And I've decided that distinction doesn't matter nearly as much as I once assumed it would. And it called to me twice more in those woods after that. Once in Renee's voice, my ex-wife's voice, asking why I'd left her out there alone. And once, worst of all, in a voice I didn't recognize at first and then did, with a lurch of horror, as my own voice, calling my own name back to me from somewhere off to my left, low and wrong, the cadence slightly off in a way that made my skin crawl worse than the calls and voices I loved had. And I did not answer either time, and I kept moving, using the compass app on a phone with no signal, holding a bearing as close to south-southwest as I could manage through brush that fought every step. And I do not know, to this day, how long that stretch of forest actually took me, because my watch had stopped sometime after the truck, the battery drained or the cold killing it, I never found out which. I came out onto County Road 116 a little after 9 that night, by my best guess, roughly a mile and a half east of the Redfern turnoff. Half frozen, my hands too numb to properly work the sat phone's buttons, and I saw headlights before I heard the engine. And Arlene Pelagia's old Subaru parked at the gate exactly where she'd said she'd be. Engine running for the heat, and she told me later she'd been sitting there since 4:30 that afternoon, 4.5 hours because something had told her I'd need more time than I thought I would. And I don't remember much of the drive back into Ellie. And I remember her insisting on taking me straight to Ellie Blumenson Community Hospital instead of home, where a nurse treated the early stages of frostbite on 2 of my fingers and told me I was lucky it wasn't worse. And I remember a Lake County Sheriff's deputy taking a statement. I could feel him not fully believing even as he wrote it down. Dutifully, professionally, promising an officer would drive out to Redfern to check the property. And I remember Arlene coming back 3 days later, once I was staying at her spare room rather than risk driving all the way back to Duluth in the state I was in, to tell me the deputy had gone out, found the lodge locked and dark, the fire long dead in the wood stove, and no sign of forced entry, and no sign of Sandra Voss or anyone else, and that Voss Holdings' registered agent, when the sheriff's office followed up, had responded only with a form letter noting the property was between caretakers and thanking the county for its diligence, which told me, more clearly than anything else could have, that this had happened enough times before for the family to have a form letter ready, and Arlene dug a little further on her own after that, and the way she'd clearly been unable to stop doing for years by that point, and told me a month later that public records showed no sign Sandra Voss or her husband had sold or transferred the Redfern property, that the LLC remained active and current on its taxes, and that a change of registered agent filing had gone through with the Minnesota Secretary of State that February, replacing Sandra's name with a law firm out of Minneapolis, the kind of quiet substitution a family makes, Arlene said, when they'd not be the name anyone finds when they go looking. And whether that meant Sandra Voss had simply stepped back from a business she found distasteful, or whether she'd become, in some way I didn't let myself think about for very long, part of the arrangement's own ledger, unresolved rather than recalled. And I have no way of knowing, and Arlene, when I asked her directly, only said that in 20 years of pulling this thread, she'd learned to stop expecting the Voss family's paperwork to tell her the truth about anything. Once I could think straight again, I tried, twice, to make the story land somewhere it might actually change something. And I called a reporter at the regional paper out of Duluth who covered Lake and St. Lee County government, laid it all out as calmly and factually as I could manage, the missing persons list Arlene had pulled, the ledger, the pattern of caretakers stretching back to 1938, and she was kind about it, careful even. But I could hear in the pauses exactly how the piece would have to be written if it ran at all. Local man describes unexplained encounter, and she told me, not unkindly, that without something more than journals and a spooked ex-caretaker's word she couldn't get it past an editor. And I tried the county board next, sat through public comment at a January meeting with a folder of photocopies under my arm, and got 2 minutes at the microphone before the chair thanked me for my input and moved to the next item on the agenda. And I watched 2 board members exchange a look on my way back to my seat that told me how that comment period would be remembered. And my sister Beth, when I told her the whole thing over the phone, then the sanded-down version I'd been giving her all winter, went quiet for a long time and then said, gently, that she loved me and that the last year had been the hardest of my life, and that sometimes the mind protects itself in strange ways under that kind of weight, and that was her trying to be kind, and it landed like being told I was losing it, but I didn't correct her, because I didn't have the energy left to fight for a version of events nobody had reason to want to be true. I never got the second half of that January's pay, and I never got any of what I would have earned through the rest of the winter, and I never got so much as a returned call from Sandra Voss. Though a lawyer's letter did reach me 11 days after I got back to Duluth, care of an address I'd given nobody but the hospital, reminding me in cold, precise language that early termination of the caretaker agreement forfeited compensation disbursed, and that Voss Holdings reserved to pursue recovery of the same, and a threat they have not, as of this writing, followed through on, though I check my mail every day half expecting to find they've changed their mind, and I paid off what I owed on my mother's hospital bill more slowly after that, without the second and third installments I'd been counting on. And she passed in March at St. Luke's, with me holding her hand, her actual voice telling me it was all right. Go on home and get some rest, and I have never once, since that January night in the kitchen at Redfern, been able to hear my mother's voice, even in memory, even at her own funeral, without some cold, reflexive part of my mind checking first to make sure it was really her. I don't sleep well anymore, not really, not the way I did before that winter, and I keep at least one light on in every apartment I've lived in since, which has been two. And I've caught myself, more times than I want to count, standing at a closed door listening for a knock that isn't coming, or freezing at the sound of my own name called from another room by someone who turns out, every single time so far, to be who they sound like, and a doctor at the VA clinic, where Denny convinced me to get checked out since my county insurance had lapsed, used the phrase hypervigilance consistent with acute stress, and offered me a referral to a counselor. And I still haven't called that counselor, not because I don't think I need it, but because I don't know how to describe what happened to someone whose job is to help me process trauma, without making them wonder whether I'm the kind of man who needs a different kind of help than counseling provides. And Mabel asked me, on a video call in April, why I don't tell bedtime stories about the winter anymore, since I used to tell her about the deer and the lookout tower years back. And I told her I was saving them, which wasn't a lie exactly, and she seemed satisfied with that in the easy way 6-year-olds are satisfied with almost anything. And I hung up that call and sat on my kitchen floor for a while after. And the way I used to sit on the kitchen floor at Redfern, though there was no fire to keep going in that apartment and no need for one. And I'm not entirely sure why my body still went there anyway. It's July now, as I'm putting this down, 6 months on. And I ran into a man 2 weeks ago at the same unemployment office in Duluth where all of this started, a laid-off pipefitter named Dave Crenshaw, whom I knew a little from a job site years back. And he was in good spirits for the first time in months because he'd just gotten off the phone with a property management company about a winter caretaker position, remote, up near Ely somewhere, paying more than he'd made in 2 years of regular work. And he was laughing about how it sounded almost too good to be true, and he asked, since I'd worked up that way, if I knew anything about a place called Redfern. And I stood there in that fluorescent-lit waiting room with the same forms in my hand I'd been filling out 11 months earlier. And Dave Crenshaw looked at me, still smiling, waiting for whatever I was going to say next, and I want to tell you I warned him, and I want to be able to write down here that I told him everything, the tracks, and the voices, the shed full of journals, the thing in the kitchen doorway saying soon in a voice that used to be my mother's, but Dave's got a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage 6 weeks behind, and I know that number on the offer sheet better than almost anyone alive. And I know exactly what $6,200 a month looks like when you're staring at a stack of bills you can't pay. And some cold, tired part of me, the same part that's checked my mother's voice for wrongness every day since January, just said, "That's great, Dave. Hope it works out," and let him walk out of that office still smiling. And I have not called him since, and I tell myself every night that I still will, that there's time before November. That I'm not the kind of man who lets this keep going just because it already has a shape, and the shape doesn't need me to push it. And every night I mean it a little less than the night before. And 2 days ago I drove out past the County Road 1016 turnoff on my way to see Arlene. Not meaning to, just found myself on that stretch of highway with the gas needle low. And the iron gate at the head of the access road, which had stood open every single time I passed through it that winter, was shut now and padlocked. And someone had nailed a second sign beneath the old Piarvitate one, fresh cut lumber. And the paint still bright, that reads simply Caretaker, Want, with a phone number I didn't recognize and didn't call. And I sat there on the shoulder with the engine running for longer than I want to admit, before I finally pulled back onto the highway and drove home.